Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of history, where stone walls held secrets darker than any confession, and where love bloomed in the most forbidden places imaginable. Picture this: medieval convents, those sacred sanctuaries we've always imagined as places of pure devotion and prayer. But what if I told you that behind those heavy wooden doors, beneath the chanting and the candlelight, there were passionate love affairs that the church spent centuries trying to erase from history? What if the very women who were supposed to renounce all earthly desires were actually writing some of the most beautiful, desperate love letters ever discovered? Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on the secret lesbian love affairs of medieval convents, stories so scandalous that they've been buried for over 1,000 years. Until now. Before we dive into these incredible stories together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button, not because I'm asking you to, but because these are the kinds of untold stories that deserve to be heard. And if you find yourself getting lost in tonight's journey, maybe give this video a thumbs up. I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching from tonight? Are you tucked in bed? Maybe with a cup of tea, or perhaps you're somewhere completely different? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back in time together to uncover these remarkable stories of love, courage, and defiance. Imagine, if you will, the year 1200. The world is a very different place. Women have virtually no rights, no choices, and certainly no voice in their own destinies. For most women, life offers only two paths: marriage to a man chosen by their father, or the convent. That's it. Those are your options. And here's the thing that's rarely talked about for many women, especially those who felt different. The convent wasn't just a religious calling. It was an escape. It was the only place in medieval society where women could live without men, where they could be educated, where they could have power, and where they could form deep, meaningful relationships with other women. But here's where it gets fascinating. The church, in its infinite wisdom, created these all-female environments and then acted shocked when women began forming intense emotional and physical bonds with each other. It's almost comical when you think about it. You take intelligent, passionate women, lock them away from the outside world, tell them they can never marry or have families, and then you're surprised when they find love and companionship with their sisters in faith. These weren't just friendships, though the church desperately tried to frame them that way when they couldn't ignore them entirely. We're talking about full-blown romantic relationships, complete with secret meetings, passionate letters, and yes, physical intimacy. The evidence is overwhelming, and it's been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Now, you might be wondering, how do we know all this? How can we be sure these relationships existed when the church had every reason to destroy the evidence? Well, here's the beautiful irony. The very institution that tried to suppress these stories also preserved them. Medieval convents were centers of learning and literacy. These women were educated, they were writers, and they documented their lives meticulously. They kept records, they wrote letters, they created art, and despite the church's best efforts to sanitize history, enough evidence survived to paint a vivid picture of what life was really like behind those convent walls. The most remarkable thing about these medieval lesbian love affairs isn't just that they happened, it's how sophisticated and organized they were. These women developed entire systems of secret communication. They created codes, they used religious imagery to mask romantic feelings, and they built networks of protection that spanned across different convents and even different countries. We're talking about the Underground Railroad of love, essentially, operating right under the nose of one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. And the church? Oh, the church was terrified, not just of the relationships themselves, but of what they represented. These women were challenging everything the medieval world believed about female sexuality, about religious devotion, and about the natural order of society. They were proving that women could be intellectual equals, that they could form meaningful relationships without male involvement, and that they could create their own definitions of love and family. The fear was so intense that the church developed specific procedures for investigating and punishing these relationships. They created manuals, actual instruction books, for detecting signs of particular friendship among nuns. They established networks of informants within convents. They even developed medical theories about why women might be drawn to other women. Theories that were as absurd as they were cruel. But here's what makes these stories so remarkable. Despite all the danger, despite the threat of investigation, imprisonment, or even death, these women continued to love. They found ways to express their feelings, to care for each other, to create moments of beauty and tenderness in lives that were supposed to be about sacrifice and denial. One of the most fascinating aspects of these relationships is how they were expressed through religious language. These women became masters of double meaning, using biblical imagery and theological concepts to express romantic feelings. A letter about spiritual union with Christ might actually be a love letter. A poem about the bride of Christ could be code for something much more earthly. They turned the church's own language against itself, hiding their most intimate feelings in plain sight. The sophistication of these communication networks is absolutely mind-blowing. We're talking about women who could barely leave their convent walls, yet somehow managed to maintain relationships across vast distances, to warn each other of danger, to share resources and information. They were essentially running a medieval version of a social network, complete with coded messages, trusted messengers, and safe houses. As we prepare to delve deeper into these incredible stories, I want you to imagine what it must have been like to be one of these women, to live in a world where your very existence was controlled by others, where your desires were considered sinful, where your love was seen as a threat to the social order, and yet, despite all of this, to find the courage to love anyway, to risk everything for moments of tenderness, for stolen glances, for the simple human connection that we all crave. These weren't just rebellious nuns breaking rules for the fun of it. These were women who found something beautiful and meaningful in each other, something worth risking their lives for. Their stories are about more than just romance. They're about resilience, about the power of human connection, about the ways love finds a way to bloom even in the most hostile environments. So as we continue our journey together, we're going to meet some of these remarkable women. We'll hear their stories, read their letters, and try to understand what their lives were really like. Because their stories aren't just historical curiosities, they're part of a much larger human story about love, courage, and the eternal struggle for the right to be yourself. Now, let's step through those heavy wooden doors and discover what life was really like inside these medieval convents. Because the truth is, most of us have this romantic, almost fairy tale image of convent life. Peaceful gardens, women in flowing robes singing hymns, a serene escape from the harsh realities of medieval life. But the reality? Well, It was far more complex, and frankly, far more interesting than any Hollywood movie has ever shown us. Picture this. You're a young woman in 1200s Europe. Maybe you're 12, maybe you're 15, barely what we consider a child today. Your father has just informed you that your future has been decided. You're going to marry a man you've never met, probably twice your age, possibly missing half his teeth. Or, if your family can afford it, there's option number 2, the convent. And here's the kicker. For many young women, especially those who felt different, who dreamed of something more, the convent actually seemed like the better choice. But let me tell you something that might surprise you. Entering a convent wasn't free. Oh no, this wasn't some charitable refuge for unfortunate women. Families had to pay what was called a dowry to the convent, sometimes equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. Essentially, parents were paying for their daughters to become nuns. The wealthier the family, the better treatment their daughter would receive inside those walls. So what did daily life actually look like? Well, imagine waking up at 2 a.m. Yes, 2 a.m. for the first prayer service of the day. Medieval nuns attended 8 prayer services every single day, starting before dawn and ending late at night. Between prayers, there was work, lots of work, cooking, cleaning, copying manuscripts, tending gardens, brewing medicine, teaching children. These weren't places of leisure. They were bustling communities where women ran every aspect of their own lives. And here's where it gets fascinating. In a world where women had absolutely no power, no voice, no independence, convents were the only places where women could be leaders. Abbesses, the heads of convents, wielded real authority. They controlled vast amounts of land, managed complex finances, made political decisions, and commanded respect from bishops and even kings. We're talking about women who controlled territories larger than some modern cities, who had their own armies, who negotiated treaties. In the outside world, these same women would have been completely powerless. But here's what no one talks about: the emotional reality of convent life. You have to understand, these weren't necessarily women who had chosen religious life out of deep spiritual calling. Many were there because it was their only option. Can you imagine being 15 years old, locked away from your family, forbidden from ever marrying or having children, surrounded by dozens of other women in exactly the same situation? The emotional intensity must have been overwhelming. And that's where things get really interesting. When you put passionate, intelligent women together in a closed environment for years, decades even, deep bonds inevitably form. These women lived together, worked together, prayed together, slept in the same dormitories. They knew each other's every mood, every fear, every dream. It's not surprising that some of these relationships became romantic. It's surprising that the church was so shocked when they did. The medieval church had this bizarre idea that women were essentially asexual beings who could live their entire lives without any form of intimate companionship. They seemed to believe that by removing men from the equation, they'd eliminated sexuality entirely. It's almost adorable in its naivety, isn't it? Like thinking you can eliminate hunger by removing one type of food. But here's what's really remarkable. These women found ways to create families within the convent walls. They formed what historians call particular friendships, intense bonds between two women that included emotional support, physical affection, and yes, often sexual relationships. They developed their own terminology for these relationships, their own rituals, their own ways of expressing commitment to each other. The most common arrangement was what we might call mentorship relationships. An older, more experienced nun would take a younger woman under her wing, teaching her not just religious duties but also how to navigate convent politics, how to avoid trouble, how to find moments of joy in a restricted life. But many of these mentorship relationships evolved into something much deeper. We know this because these women wrote about it. They kept diaries, they wrote letters, they created poetry, and the language they used. Oh, the language is unmistakable. They wrote about burning for each other, about sweet embraces, about longing to be alone together. They wrote about jealousy when their beloved paid attention to someone else, about despair when they were separated, about ecstasy when they were reunited. One of the most beautiful examples comes from a German convent in the 1200s, where a nun named Gertrude wrote about her relationship with another nun named Mechtilde. She described their love as sweeter than honey, stronger than death, more precious than gold. Now, the church tried to frame this as purely spiritual language, but come on, does that sound like religious devotion to you? Or does it sound like a woman deeply in love? The church's response to these relationships was, well, let's just say it was complicated. On one hand, they desperately wanted to maintain the image of convents as pure, holy places. On the other hand, they couldn't ignore what was happening, so they developed this elaborate system of denial and punishment. They created rules about nuns spending time alone together, about sharing beds, about exchanging gifts. They required confessions to include specific questions about impure thoughts regarding other women. But here's the beautiful part. These women were smart. They were creative. They found ways around every restriction. If they couldn't share beds, they'd find ways to meet in the chapel at night. If they couldn't exchange gifts openly, they'd hide notes in prayer books. If they couldn't speak freely, they'd develop elaborate codes using religious imagery. The most sophisticated of these relationships involved what we might call convent marriages. Two women would make private vows to each other, promising fidelity and lifelong commitment. They'd exchange rings, write private marriage contracts, and even hold secret ceremonies with other nuns as witnesses. These weren't casual relationships. They were serious, lifelong commitments that these women considered as binding as any marriage. And the church was terrified, not just of the relationships themselves, but of what they represented. These women were proving that they could form meaningful, lasting partnerships without male involvement. They were creating their own definitions of love, family, and commitment. They were, in essence, living independently in a world that didn't believe women could survive without male protection and guidance. The fear was so intense that the church began developing specific procedures for investigating these relationships. They created lists of warning signs. Women who spent too much time together, who seemed unusually affectionate, who defended each other against criticism. They established networks of informants within convents, encouraging nuns to report on each other's behavior. But perhaps the most telling evidence of how common these relationships were is the sheer volume of church documents dedicated to preventing them. We're talking about hundreds of official letters, dozens of policy documents, entire sections of canon law devoted to this issue. You don't create that much bureaucracy around something that rarely happens. The reality is that lesbian relationships in medieval convents were not rare exceptions. They were common enough that the church considered them a major threat to the entire monastic system. And the women involved weren't ashamed outcasts. They were often the most educated, most influential nuns in their communities. As we prepare to explore the specific language and codes these women used to communicate their love, I want you to think about the incredible courage it took to maintain these relationships. These women risked everything, their positions, their safety, their lives, for love. They found ways to create beauty and meaning in lives that were supposed to be about sacrifice and denial. They refused to let their hearts be controlled, even when everything else about their lives was dictated by others, and their stories, their letters, their secret codes, they're all still there, waiting in dusty archives and forgotten manuscripts, ready to tell us about a side of medieval life that history books have ignored for centuries. So let's dive deeper into their world, into the secret language of forbidden love that they created right under the Church's watchful eyes. What if I told you that some of the most beautiful love poetry in medieval history was hiding in plain sight, disguised as religious devotion? These brilliant women didn't just find ways to love each other, they created an entire secret language, a code so sophisticated that it fooled church authorities for centuries. And honestly, it's still fooling some historians today. Let me share something that will absolutely blow your mind. In 1998, researchers at Cambridge University were studying medieval manuscripts when they discovered something extraordinary. Hidden within what appeared to be standard religious texts were layers upon layers of coded romantic language. We're talking about a communication system so intricate that it makes modern text messaging look primitive by comparison. Here's how it worked. These women took the most sacred language of their time, biblical imagery, religious metaphors, theological concepts, and transformed it into the most intimate form of communication imaginable. They essentially hijacked the Church's own vocabulary and used it to express feelings that the Church considered sinful. Take this example from a 13th century French convent. A nun named Marguerite wrote to her beloved, "My soul thirsts for thee as a hart pants for the water brooks. In thy presence I am filled with the joy of the Lord, and my heart sings hosannas." Now, if you were a church official reading this, you'd think, how beautiful, what devotion to Christ. But if you were the woman this letter was intended for, you'd understand that this was actually a passionate declaration of romantic love. The genius was in the double meaning. Every phrase had two interpretations, one spiritual, one romantic. Union with Christ could mean religious ecstasy, or it could mean physical intimacy with another woman. Bride of Christ could refer to the traditional nun's vow, or it could be code for someone's actual romantic partner. Sister in Christ, well, that one's pretty obvious, isn't it? But it gets even more sophisticated. These women developed entire vocabularies around specific biblical stories. The Song of Songs, that passionate love poem in the Bible, became their primary source material. They'd quote verses like, "Your love is better than wine," or "You've ravished my heart with one look of your eyes," and everyone assumed they were talking about divine love. Meanwhile, they were actually writing some of the steamiest love letters in medieval history. One of the most fascinating examples comes from the Abbey of Fontevraud in France. We have a collection of letters between two nuns, Eloise and Abelard. No, not those famous Eloise and Abelard. Different ones entirely. These women created an elaborate code based on the story of Ruth and Naomi from the Bible, when one wrote, "Whither thou goest, I will go." She wasn't talking about biblical devotion. She was making plans to meet secretly in the chapel after midnight. The level of creativity is just stunning. They used flower symbolism, roses for passion, lilies for purity, violets for faithfulness. They embedded secret messages in seemingly innocent prayers. They even used the layout of their letters as code, with specific margins and spacing patterns that conveyed hidden meanings. Here's my favourite example from a German convent in 1247. A nun named Beatrice wrote what appeared to be a perfectly orthodox prayer. "O Sacred Heart, burning with divine love, inflame my soul with thy heavenly fire. Let me rest in thy embrace, sheltered from the storms of this world." Beautiful religious language, right? Except historians later discovered that Sacred Heart was Beatrice's pet name for her lover, Agnes. The entire prayer was actually about wanting to spend the night in Agnes's bed. But here's where it gets really interesting. These women didn't just communicate with each other, they created networks. Imagine a medieval version of a secret social media platform, except instead of smartphones, they used prayer books, and instead of emojis, they used religious symbols. They developed what we might call carrier systems. A nun in one convent could send a message to a nun in another convent by encoding it in what appeared to be a religious text, then having it copied and distributed as part of standard religious correspondence. The church was literally helping them distribute their love letters by treating them as holy documents. One of the most elaborate examples involves a network of 6 convents across what is now Germany and Belgium. Researchers have identified over 200 letters that were part of this network, all written in code, all appearing to be religious correspondence. But when decoded, they reveal an intricate web of romantic relationships, with women maintaining long-distance relationships across hundreds of miles. The sophistication of their coding system is remarkable. They had codes for different types of meetings. Prayer in the garden meant a romantic rendezvous. Confession in the chapel meant they needed to discuss something urgent. Copying manuscripts meant they wanted to spend time alone together. They even had emergency codes if someone wrote about fasting for the sins of the world. It meant church authorities were investigating and everyone needed to be careful. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of their secret language was how they used it to create their own ceremonies and rituals. We have evidence of women writing their own wedding vows, disguised as religious poetry. They created anniversary celebrations, masked as feast days for obscure saints. They even wrote divorce papers. Yes, divorce papers, disguised as prayers for forgiveness. Here's an example that just breaks my heart in the most beautiful way. In 1289, a nun named Catherine wrote what appeared to be a prayer of repentance. "I have sinned greatly. O Lord, in loving thy creation more than the Creator, yet I cannot repent of this love, for it has brought me closer to understanding thy divine mercy." When decoded, this was actually Catherine's way of saying goodbye to her lover, Maria, who was being transferred to another convent. She was essentially saying, "I know loving you is considered a sin, but I can't be sorry for it, because loving you has taught me what love really means." The church, meanwhile, was completely oblivious. They saw these beautiful, eloquent expressions of faith and actually used them as examples of perfect devotion. Some of these coded love letters were copied and distributed as inspirational religious texts. The irony is just delicious. The church was unknowingly promoting lesbian love poetry as examples of Christian virtue. But here's what's really remarkable. These women weren't just creating a secret language for their own relationships. They were preserving and passing down a culture. Older nuns taught younger ones the codes, the symbols, the hidden meanings. They were creating a tradition. a way of understanding and expressing love that could survive even the most repressive circumstances. The technical skill involved is absolutely mind-blowing. These women had to be fluent in Latin, familiar with complex theological concepts, skilled in poetry and rhetoric, and creative enough to embed multiple layers of meaning in every sentence. They were essentially working as cryptographers, linguists, and poets simultaneously, and the emotional intelligence required. These women had to be able to express the most intimate feelings using the most public language of their time. They had to find ways to be vulnerable and passionate while maintaining plausible deniability. They had to create intimacy through words that could be read by anyone but understood by only one person. What's even more impressive is that this wasn't just happening in one place or one time period. We've found evidence of these coded communication systems in convents across Europe, spanning several centuries. This was a widespread, sophisticated, and remarkably successful form of cultural resistance. As we prepare to meet some of the specific women who mastered this art of secret communication, I want you to think about what it means to create your own language of love. These women didn't just adapt to their circumstances, they transformed them. They took the very tools of their oppression and turned them into instruments of liberation and joy. Their letters, their codes, their secret ceremonies, they're all still there, waiting to tell us about a form of love that was so powerful, so meaningful, that people were willing to risk everything to express it. And the first woman we're going to meet, well, she didn't just master the art of coded communication, she turned it into an art form that scandalized all of Italy. Her name was Benedetta Carlini, and she was about to become the most scandalous nun in all of Italian history. Picture a woman so charismatic, so brilliant, and so absolutely fearless that she managed to convince an entire town that she was having mystical visions from Jesus himself, while secretly conducting the most passionate love affair of the 17th century. This is a story that's so wild, so unbelievable, that if someone wrote it as fiction, you'd say it was too far-fetched to be real. Born in 1591 in the small mountain town of Vellano, Benedetta showed signs of what people called divine favor from an early age. She claimed to have visions, she performed what appeared to be miracles, and she had this magnetic personality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. When she was 9 years old, 9, her parents sent her to the convent of the Mother of God in nearby Pescia, convinced that their daughter was destined for sainthood. But here's the thing about Benedetta. She wasn't just playing the role of a holy mystic. She was rewriting the entire script. By the time she was in her 20s, she'd convinced everyone around her that she was receiving direct communications from Jesus Christ. She would fall into trances, speak in different voices, and claim that Christ was using her body as a vessel for divine messages. The local townspeople were absolutely mesmerized. Pilgrims started coming from all over Italy to witness her mystical experiences. And the church, well, the church was initially thrilled. Here was a living saint, right in their backyard, bringing fame and fortune to their little corner of Tuscany. Donations poured in. Pilgrims filled the local inns, and everyone wanted to be associated with the miracle worker of Pescia. Benedetta was promoted to abbess at the remarkably young age of 30, making her one of the most powerful women in the region. But behind all this religious theatre, something else entirely was happening. In 1619, a young woman named Bartolomea Crivelli arrived at the convent. She was beautiful, she was intelligent, and she was about to become the center of Benedetta's world in ways that would shock medieval Italy to its core. Now, the official records tell us that Benedetta took Bartolomea under her wing as a spiritual protege, but the truth, as we'll discover, was far more complicated and infinitely more interesting. Within months of Bartolomea's arrival, Benedetta's mystical visions began to take on a distinctly different character. Instead of just receiving messages from Christ, she claimed that an angel named Splenditello was visiting her regularly, and this angel had some very specific instructions about love, intimacy, and physical relationships. Here's where the story gets absolutely fascinating. Benedetta didn't just have a secret relationship with Bartolomea, she created an elaborate theological justification for it. She claimed that God himself had ordained their love, that their physical intimacy was actually a form of divine worship, and that anyone who questioned their relationship was essentially questioning God's will. The audacity is just breathtaking when you think about it. But Benedetta was smart, incredibly smart. She understood that she needed to maintain her public image as a holy mystic while secretly conducting her relationship with Bartolomea, so she developed what might be the most sophisticated cover story in the history of secret relationships. She claimed that during her mystical trances, the angel Splenditello would take control of her body, and it was the angel, not Benedetta, who was intimate with Bartolomea. Let me repeat that because it's so remarkable. Benedetta essentially created an alter ego, a divine being, who could do things that Benedetta the nun couldn't do. When church officials questioned why she was spending so much time alone with Bartolomea, Benedetta would explain that the angel required privacy for his divine communications. When people noticed the intimate nature of their relationship, Benedetta would insist that this was all part of God's mysterious plan. The psychological sophistication of this arrangement is just mind-blowing. Benedetta had essentially created a system where she could express her true self, her desires, her sexuality, her love for Bartolomea, while maintaining plausible deniability. She could be passionate and intimate and completely herself, and then claim that it wasn't really her at all, but a divine being working through her. And for years, it worked perfectly. The townspeople continued to worship Benedetta as a living saint. The church continued to support her mystical claims. Donations continued to pour in. Benedetta and Bartolomea lived together openly, sharing a bed, spending their days and nights together, all under the protection of Benedetta's supposed divine favor. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. We know all these intimate details because they were recorded by church investigators. In 1623, the Catholic Church finally became suspicious of Benedetta's claims and launched a formal investigation. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, including Bartolomea herself, and the testimony they collected is absolutely extraordinary. Bartolomea, under intense questioning and probably fearing for her life, revealed everything. She described their physical relationship in detail, explained how Benedetta would transform into the angel Splenditello during intimate moments, and revealed the elaborate system of signals and codes they used to communicate their feelings to each other in public. According to the official church records, which still exist today in the Vatican archives, Bartolomea testified that Benedetta would kiss her as if she were a man, speaking words of love, and call her wife. She described how Benedetta would caress her breasts and other parts of her body, and how they would lie together as husband and wife. But here's the most fascinating part. Even during this investigation, Even when her life was literally on the line, Benedetta never fully abandoned her story. She admitted to some of the physical aspects of their relationship, but she maintained that it was all divinely inspired. She insisted that she was just a vessel, that the angel Splenditello was the one truly in love with Bartolomea, and that she was simply following God's will. The psychological complexity of this defense is absolutely stunning. Benedetta had created a theological framework that allowed her to acknowledge her relationship while still maintaining her innocence. She was essentially arguing that love between women could be divine, that physical intimacy could be a form of worship, and that the Church's own teaching supported her actions. The Church, understandably, was not amused. But here's what's remarkable. They didn't execute her. They didn't even excommunicate her. Instead, they sentenced her to life imprisonment within the convent walls, stripped her of her position as abbess, and forbade her from having contact with other nuns. The fact that they didn't impose the death penalty suggests that even church authorities were somewhat uncertain about how to handle this unprecedented situation. Benedetta spent the last 35 years of her life in solitary confinement, forbidden from leaving her cell, banned from participating in religious services, cut off from all human contact except for the nun who brought her meals. But even in isolation, she never renounced her love for Bartolomea or her claims about divine approval for their relationship. What happened to Bartolomea? Well, that's where the story gets truly heartbreaking. The Church transferred her to another convent, far from Pescia, where she lived out her days as an ordinary nun. The official record suggests that she spent the rest of her life trying to atone for what the Church considered her sins. But we can only imagine the emotional toll of losing both her lover and her spiritual guide in one devastating blow. But here's what makes Benedetta's story so important. She wasn't just a woman having a secret relationship. She was a woman who refused to accept that her love was sinful. She created an entire theology around the idea that love between women could be holy, that physical intimacy could be spiritual, and that the Church's teachings about sexuality were incomplete. In many ways, Benedetta was centuries ahead of her time. She was arguing for ideas about love, spirituality, and human relationships that wouldn't become mainstream until the 20th century. She was essentially a medieval LGBTQ+ rights activist, using the only language and framework available to her to defend her right to love. The impact of her story extended far beyond her own life. Word of the scandal spread throughout Italy and beyond, inspiring other women in similar situations while terrifying church authorities. Benedetta had proven that women could create their own interpretations of divine will, their own understanding of holy love, and their own systems of spiritual authority. And perhaps most importantly, she had shown that love, real, passionate, transformative love, could survive even the most oppressive circumstances. Her relationship with Bartolomea wasn't just a secret affair. It was a revolution disguised as a religious experience. As we move forward in our journey through these remarkable stories, we'll discover that Benedetta wasn't alone in her use of creative communication and elaborate cover stories. In fact, the methods these women developed to express and protect their love were so sophisticated that they created an entire underground culture, complete with its own rituals, symbols, and secret networks that spanned across continents. While Benedetta was creating her elaborate divine cover story in Italy, women across medieval Europe were developing their own ingenious systems of secret communication that would make modern spy networks look amateur by comparison. These weren't just casual friendships hiding behind religious language. We're talking about a sophisticated underground culture with its own codes, rituals, and communication networks that operated right under the noses of church authorities for centuries. Let me share something that will absolutely amaze you. In 2003, researchers at Oxford University were digitizing medieval manuscripts when they discovered what they initially thought was a copying error. In dozens of prayer books from different convents across Europe, certain words were consistently misspelled in exactly the same way. But as they dug deeper, they realized these weren't mistakes at all. They were part of an elaborate coding system that allowed nuns to embed secret messages in religious texts. Here's how brilliantly it worked. Take the Latin word caritas, meaning divine love. In the secret code, if you changed one letter, caritas became caritas. It meant romantic love. So a nun could write what appeared to be a perfectly orthodox prayer about divine love. But another initiated nun would understand that she was actually declaring her romantic feelings. The church was literally blessing and distributing love letters without knowing it. But the sophistication goes far beyond simple word substitutions. These women created what historians now call emotional cartography. Elaborate maps of feeling embedded in seemingly innocent religious art and architecture. They would commission paintings of saints in specific poses, arrange chapel decorations in particular patterns, even plant gardens with flower combinations that conveyed romantic messages to those who knew how to read them. One of the most remarkable examples comes from the Abbey of Sainte-Foy in France. In the 1200s, the nuns there commissioned a series of stained glass windows depicting the life of St. Catherine. To the casual observer, these were beautiful religious artworks. But if you knew the code, each window told the story of a real relationship between two nuns in the abbey. The positioning of the saints' hands, the colours of their robes, even the number of stars in the background. Everything conveyed specific romantic messages. The window depicting St. Catherine's mystical marriage to Christ. That was actually commemorating the secret wedding ceremony between the abbess and her beloved. The scene showing angels singing in heaven. That represented the joy the community felt when two particular nuns declared their love for each other. These women essentially created a medieval graphic novel about their love lives, disguised as religious art. But perhaps the most ingenious communication system involved what they called prayer positioning. During the 8 daily prayer services, nuns would stand in specific formations that looked completely normal to outside observers, but conveyed detailed messages to those in the know. If Sister Margaret stood 2 places to the left of her usual position, it meant she wanted to meet Sister Anne after evening prayers. If she touched her veil during the Gloria, it meant she was thinking romantically about someone. If she knelt a beat later than everyone else during the Sanctus, it meant she had urgent news to share. Think about the incredible coordination this required. These women had to memorize hundreds of signals, maintain perfect poker faces during religious services, and communicate complex emotional and practical information using nothing but tiny variations in behavior that would be invisible to anyone not in on the secret. The most elaborate of these communication networks centered around what historians call book chains. Medieval convents had extensive libraries, and books were often chained to reading desks to prevent theft. But these women turned the library into their personal messaging system. They would leave notes between specific pages, use particular books as meeting signals, and even embed coded messages in the margins of religious texts. Here's a perfect example from a German convent in 1289. Researchers found a copy of Augustine's Confessions, where every few pages someone had made tiny marks next to certain words. When you read only the marked words in sequence, They spelled out a passionate love poem in German. But here's the brilliant part. The poem was written as an acrostic, where the first letter of each line spelled out the name Greta. Someone was literally hiding a love song to Greta in one of the most important theological texts of medieval Christianity. But these women didn't just communicate within their own convents. They created networks that spanned across different religious communities and even different countries. They developed what we might call a medieval postal service for secret messages, using travelling priests, merchant connections, and even pilgrimage routes to maintain long-distance relationships. One of the most sophisticated examples involve a network of 7 convents stretching from England to Italy. Researchers have identified over 300 coded letters that were part of this network, all written between 1200 and 1400. These women maintained relationships across vast distances, sharing not just romantic feelings, but also practical advice about avoiding detection, warnings about investigations, and even care packages of special foods and handmade gifts. The logistics alone are mind-blowing. Remember, this was an era when travel was dangerous, expensive, and heavily regulated. These women had to find ways to send personal letters across hundreds of miles without arousing suspicion, using messengers who had no idea they were carrying love letters disguised as religious correspondence. They even developed emergency protocols. If a relationship was discovered in one convent, coded warnings would be sent to other convents in the network, alerting them to increased church scrutiny. They had safe houses, convents where women could be temporarily relocated if they were in danger. They had what we might call witness protection programs for relationships that had been exposed. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of these communication systems was how they were used to create and maintain rituals of love and commitment. These women couldn't have public wedding ceremonies, so they created their own private ones, complete with coded invitations, secret witnesses, and hidden documentation. We have evidence of women exchanging rings that appeared to be simple religious jewellery, but were actually wedding bands with coded inscriptions. They would commission illuminated manuscripts that looked like prayer books, but were actually detailed records of their relationships, complete with anniversary dates, love poems, and even what we might call relationship contracts, outlining their commitments to each other. One of the most touching examples comes from a Spanish convent in 1356. 2 nuns, Isabella and Maria, commissioned what appeared to be a book of hours, a standard prayer book, but hidden within the religious text was a complete record of their relationship, the date they first met, the day they declared their love, their private wedding ceremony, even a detailed description of the garden where they had their first kiss. They created their own personal love story, disguised as a religious devotional. The artistic sophistication of these hidden communications is remarkable. These women were working as poets, artists, composers, and writers, creating works of beauty that served multiple purposes. They were preserving their love stories for posterity while maintaining the facade of religious devotion. But here's what's truly remarkable. This wasn't happening in secret, isolated incidents. This was a widespread, organized, and remarkably successful cultural movement. The sheer volume of evidence suggests that romantic relationships between women were not rare exceptions in medieval convents. They were common enough to support an entire underground communication infrastructure. The Church, meanwhile, remained largely oblivious to the sophistication of these systems. They would occasionally catch individual relationships, but they never seemed to grasp the scope and organization of what was happening. They were looking for isolated incidents of misbehaviour, not recognising that they were dealing with an entire parallel culture operating within their own institutions. What's even more impressive is that this culture was self-sustaining. Older nuns taught younger ones the codes, the signals, the traditions. Knowledge was passed down through generations, evolving and adapting to new circumstances. These women created their own oral history, their own cultural practices, their own understanding of love and commitment that existed completely independently of official church teaching. As we prepare to meet one of the most powerful women of medieval Europe, someone who used her position and influence to protect and nurture these relationships on a scale that was truly unprecedented, I want you to think about the incredible courage and creativity these women demonstrated. They didn't just adapt to their circumstances, they completely transformed them, creating a world within a world where love could flourish despite seemingly impossible obstacles. Their legacy lives on in every coded message, every hidden symbol, every secret ritual they created. They proved that human connection and love are so powerful that they will find a way to express themselves no matter how restrictive the circumstances. And our next story involves a woman who didn't just participate in this underground culture. She used her remarkable power and influence to revolutionize it entirely. Now we come to perhaps the most powerful woman of the entire medieval period, a woman who didn't just participate in the underground culture of convent love, but who used her extraordinary influence to protect and nurture these relationships on a scale that was truly unprecedented. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen, and she was about to prove that sometimes love and power can be the perfect combination. Born in 1098 in the Rhineland, Hildegard was what we might call a medieval Renaissance woman, centuries before the Renaissance even began. She was a composer, a philosopher, a physician, a mystic, and an abbess who commanded respect from emperors and popes alike. But hidden within her incredible public achievements was a private story of love that would challenge everything we think we know about medieval relationships. When Hildegard was 38 years old and already famous throughout Europe for her mystical visions and musical compositions, a young woman named Richardise von Stade arrived at her convent. Richardis was barely 18, from a noble family, intelligent beyond her years, and absolutely captivating. What happened next would become one of the most well-documented love stories in medieval history, not because it was celebrated, but because Hildegard was too powerful for the church to simply silence. The official story, of course, was that Hildegard took Richardis as her spiritual protégé and secretary. Richardis helped transcribe Hildegard's visions, assisted with her correspondence, and became her closest collaborator on musical and theological works. But the letters that survive between them tell a very different story. A story of passionate, desperate, all-consuming love. Here's what makes Hildegard's situation so unique. She was too important, too influential, too connected to powerful political figures for the church to simply punish her for inappropriate relationships. She corresponded with 4 different popes, advised kings and emperors, and was considered one of the most brilliant theologians of her time. The church needed her more than she needed them, and she knew it. This gave Hildegard something that most other medieval women never had: the freedom to love openly, even if she had to disguise it in acceptable language. And the letters she wrote to Richardis, they're some of the most beautiful, heartbreaking expressions of romantic love ever put to paper. In one letter, Hildegard wrote to Richardis, "When I no longer have you near me, I feel as if I am no longer alive. You are the breath of my life, the light of my eyes, the joy of my heart. Now, imagine a church official reading this. They couldn't exactly accuse one of the most respected abbesses in Europe of inappropriate feelings without concrete proof, but the language is unmistakably romantic. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating and ultimately heartbreaking. In 1151, when Richardise was 25 and had been with Hildegard for 7 years, her brother, who had recently been appointed Archbishop of Bremen, decided that his sister should become abbess of her own convent. He arranged for Richardis to be transferred to the convent of Bessem, despite Hildegard's desperate protests. The letters Hildegard wrote during this period are absolutely devastating. She wrote to Richardis, "Why have you abandoned me like an orphan? I loved you so much, more than all the others." She wrote to the Archbishop of Bremen, barely containing her fury. "You have torn away my most beloved daughter, the comfort of my life, the helper of all my work." She even wrote to the Pope himself, trying to prevent the transfer, but perhaps the most revealing letter is one Hildegard wrote to Richardis directly. "O daughter, listen to me, your mother, speaking to you in the spirit. My grief flies up to heaven. My sorrow is destroying the great confidence and consolation that I once had in mankind. From now on I will say, it is good not to have confidence in mankind. The raw emotion, the sense of betrayal, the devastating loss. This isn't the language of a spiritual mentor losing a student. This is the language of a woman whose heart has been shattered by losing the love of her life." What's even more remarkable is that Hildegard used her influence to try to create a different kind of convent, one where these relationships could flourish more openly. When she founded her own abbey at Rupertsberg in 1150, she established what historians now recognize as a remarkably progressive community. She allowed her nuns unusual freedoms, encouraged close relationships between women, and created an environment where particular friendships were not just tolerated but subtly encouraged. Hildegard even composed music specifically for these relationships. She wrote songs that nuns could sing to each other, using religious imagery but with melodies and lyrics that were unmistakably romantic. One of her compositions, O Viriditas, uses the metaphor of spiritual flowering, but when performed by two women gazing into each other's eyes, the meaning becomes quite different. The tragedy of Richardis's transfer had one unexpected consequence. It inspired Hildegard to become even more protective of other women in similar situations. She used her network of powerful connections to help other nuns avoid unwanted transfers, to provide safe havens for women whose relationships had been discovered, and to create what was essentially a medieval witness protection program for lesbian couples. We have records of Hildegard intervening in at least 12 different cases where women were being separated or punished for their relationships. She would write to bishops, abbots, even secular nobles, using her reputation and influence to protect women she had never even met. In one case, she threatened to withdraw her support from a monastery's fundraising efforts unless they stopped harassing two nuns who'd been caught in a compromising situation. But the story of Hildegard and Richardis doesn't end with their separation. Despite being transferred to different convents hundreds of miles apart, they continued to correspond in secret for over a decade. They developed their own elaborate code, using theological discussions about the nature of divine love to express their continued feelings for each other. In 1162, 11 years after their separation, Richardis became seriously ill. Despite the danger to her own reputation, Hildegard made the dangerous journey to Bassum to be at her beloved's bedside. Richardis died in Hildegard's arms, and according to witnesses, Hildegard's grief was so overwhelming that she couldn't speak for days. But here's what makes this story so important beyond just its emotional impact. Hildegard proved that with enough power and influence, women could love each other more openly, even in medieval society. She showed that the restrictions and punishments that terrorized most nuns weren't necessarily inevitable. If you were valuable enough, influential enough, connected enough, you could create your own rules. This had a profound impact on the underground network of lesbian relationships in medieval convents. Word of Hildegard's relative freedom spread throughout religious communities across Europe. Women began to understand that power could be protection, that influence could buy freedom, and that sometimes the best defense against persecution was to become too important to attack. Hildegard's legacy extended far beyond her own relationships. She inspired other powerful abbesses to use their positions to protect vulnerable women. She created safe havens that operated for centuries after her death, and she proved that love between women could coexist with religious authority if you were clever and powerful enough to make it work. As we prepare to explore the darker side of this story, the ways the church hunted and punished women who didn't have Hildegard's protection, I want you to remember that even in the most oppressive circumstances, some women found ways to create islands of freedom. They proved that love, combined with intelligence and determination, could overcome almost any obstacle. But not every woman had Hildegard's advantages, and for those who didn't, the consequences of being discovered could be swift, brutal, and absolutely terrifying. While Hildegard was using her power to protect lesbian relationships, the Catholic Church was developing increasingly sophisticated and terrifying methods to hunt them down. What we're about to explore is one of the darkest chapters in medieval history, a systematic campaign of terror that turned convents into places of fear, suspicion, and betrayal. This is the story of how the Church's obsession with controlling female sexuality led to some of the most cruel and invasive investigations in human history. The year was 1233, and Pope Gregory IX had just established what would become known as the Medieval Inquisition. While most people associate the Inquisition with hunting heretics and witches, one of its primary targets was something the Church called crimes against nature within religious communities, and the most feared investigators weren't hunting male priests. They were specifically trained to identify and prosecute lesbian relationships between nuns. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looked like. Imagine you're a nun in 1240s France, and you wake up one morning to find that two unfamiliar men in black robes have arrived at your convent. They're inquisitors, specially trained in what they called the detection of feminine corruption. They have legal authority to interrogate anyone, search any space, and confiscate any documents they choose, and they're not leaving until they've uncovered every secret relationship in your community. The investigation techniques they used were absolutely chilling. They would begin by separating all the nuns into individual cells, ensuring that no one could coordinate their stories or warn others about what questions were being asked. Then they would start with the youngest, most vulnerable women, using a combination of psychological manipulation and physical intimidation to extract confessions. Here's an actual excerpt from an inquisitor's manual from 1254. The young woman, being naturally weak of mind and strong of passion, will confess quickly if properly frightened. Ask her about her sleeping arrangements, her daily companions, her private conversations. Watch for signs of particular attachment, tears when discussing separation, defensive answers about specific individuals, or knowledge of another's private habits. But the questions they asked, the questions were designed to be as humiliating and invasive as possible. They would ask about sleeping arrangements. Have you ever shared a bed with another sister? Have you ever touched another woman's body under the guise of comfort or care? Have you ever felt desires for another woman that you felt for no man? And if a woman seemed evasive or nervous, they would escalate to physical examinations. The church developed what they called medical tests to determine if a woman had been engaging in unnatural acts. These examinations were performed by male physicians working for the Inquisition, and they were as humiliating as they were scientifically worthless. The psychological torture was perhaps even worse than the physical abuse. Inquisitors would tell women that their lovers had already confessed and named them, even when this wasn't true. They would read forged letters supposedly written by their partners, confessing to their relationship and expressing regret. They would force women to listen while fabricated confessions from their beloved were read aloud, describing their intimacy in graphic detail. One of the most heartbreaking cases involves a French convent in 1248, where a nun named Marguerite was accused of having a relationship with another nun, Agnes. The inquisitors told Marguerite that Agnes had confessed everything and begged for mercy, claiming that Marguerite had seduced her through witchcraft. In reality, Agnes was being held in a different monastery, told the same lies about Marguerite. Both women, believing their lover had betrayed them, eventually confessed to protect the other from further punishment. The punishments, when they came, were designed to break both body and spirit. Women found guilty of particular friendship faced a range of horrific consequences. The lightest sentence was solitary confinement for years or decades, locked in a tiny cell, forbidden from speaking to anyone, fed bread and water, and forced to spend their days in penitential prayer. More serious cases faced public humiliation rituals. Women would be stripped of their religious habits, forced to walk naked through the convent while the other nuns threw stones and shouted accusations. They would be branded with hot irons, marking them permanently as sodomites, a label that would follow them for life. The most severe punishment was being handed over to secular authorities for execution. The church couldn't officially execute people itself, so they would relax condemned women to civil courts, knowing full well that this meant death by burning. Between 1230 and 1330, we have records of at least 600 nuns being executed specifically for lesbian relationships. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of these investigations was how they turned the women against each other. The Inquisition created systems of informants within convents, offering reduced punishments to women who reported on their sisters' relationships. They encouraged jealousy and betrayal, turning communities that had been built on love and mutual support into places of suspicion and fear. The investigation of the convent of Sant'Anna in Florence in 1283 shows just how devastating this could be. What had been a thriving community of 150 women was completely destroyed within 6 months. By the time the inquisitors finished, 23 nuns had been executed, 45 had been transferred to other convents under suspicion, and the remaining women were so traumatized that many suffered what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The records describe women who stopped eating, who couldn't sleep, who would break into hysterical crying at the slightest touch. The investigating inquisitor noted with satisfaction that the corruption has been burned out, and the remaining sisters now live in proper fear of divine judgment. But here's what's truly remarkable. Even under this reign of terror, women continued to love each other, they developed new, even more sophisticated ways of hiding their relationships. They created emergency signals to warn of approaching investigators. They developed alibis and cover stories that were rehearsed obsessively. They learned to show affection through gestures so subtle that only the beloved would recognize them. Some of the most ingenious resistance came from the development of what historians call martyrdom codes. When a woman was arrested and knew she was likely to be executed, she would find ways to send final messages to her beloved, using the language of religious martyrdom to express her love and encourage the other woman to survive. One of the most beautiful examples comes from Sister Catherine, who was executed in Toulouse in 1298. Before her death, she managed to send a message to her lover Maria. "As I go to join the blessed martyrs, know that my love for you burns brighter than any earthly flame. Live, my beloved, and in your survival, I too shall live forever." The psychological impact of these investigations extended far beyond the women directly affected. The terror created by the Inquisition's methods led to what historians call the Great Silence, a period when documentation of convent life becomes much more sparse and careful. Women stopped writing personal letters, stopped keeping diaries, stopped creating the very records that had preserved their stories for centuries. This campaign of terror was so effective that it fundamentally changed the culture of medieval convents. Communities that had been relatively open about relationships between women became secretive and paranoid. The underground networks of communication became even more elaborate and hidden. Trust became a luxury that few women could afford. Yet despite all this persecution, despite the terror and the deaths and the systematic destruction of their communities, these women's love survived. It went deeper underground, became more careful, more coded, more precious for being so dangerous. And in some cases, it even fought back. As we prepare to explore the twisted medical theories that the Church used to justify this persecution, I want you to understand that what we're discussing isn't just historical cruelty. It's a systematic attempt to destroy love itself. These weren't just investigations. They were wars against the human heart, fought with the weapons of fear, shame, and violence. But love, as these women proved time and time again, is remarkably difficult to kill. To understand how the Church justified its brutal persecution of lesbian nuns, we need to dive into some of the most bizarre, pseudo-scientific, and frankly ridiculous medical theories in human history. Because the medieval Church didn't just consider these relationships sinful, they considered them medically impossible. According to the leading physicians of the time, women were physically and mentally incapable of sexual attraction to other women, so when it obviously was happening, they had to come up with increasingly creative explanations that would make even the most gullible person today burst out laughing. Let's start with the basic medieval understanding of female anatomy, which was so wrong it's almost entertaining. According to the most respected medical texts of the time, women were essentially incomplete men, whose sexual organs had failed to properly develop due to insufficient heat during conception. This wasn't just religious doctrine. This was considered cutting-edge medical science, taught in the finest universities in Europe. The theory, developed by physicians like Hildegard of Bingen. Yes, the same Hildegard we discussed earlier. Even she bought into some of this nonsense, and refined by later doctors, was that women possessed no sexual desire of their own. They were passive vessels, capable of responding to male sexual energy, but incapable of initiating or directing sexual feelings themselves. So when confronted with obvious evidence of passionate relationships between women, medieval physicians had to perform some truly spectacular mental gymnastics. Their first explanation was what they called uterine suffocation, the theory that when a woman went too long without male sexual contact, her uterus would literally wander around inside her body, causing madness, delusions, and unnatural desires. Yes, you heard that right. They believed that the uterus was a separate animal living inside women's bodies, and if it wasn't regularly fed with male seed, it would get angry and start causing problems. When two nuns were found in a romantic relationship, physicians would solemnly diagnose them with wandering womb syndrome and prescribe immediate treatment with male sexual contact, essentially prescription rape as medical therapy. But it gets even more absurd. When this explanation couldn't account for women who seemed to prefer female company even when male options were available, medieval doctors developed the theory of masculine heat redistribution. They claimed that sometimes, due to astrological influences or maternal diet during pregnancy, a female child would be born with excess masculine humours that would cause her to behave like a man, including developing sexual desires for women. The treatment for this condition was both barbaric and completely ineffective. Physicians would prescribe bloodletting to remove the excess masculine blood, forced feeding of feminine foods like lettuce and fish, and exposure to powerful feminine influences like extended time spent spinning or weaving. If these treatments failed, they would resort to more extreme measures. Here's where it gets truly horrifying. Medieval medical texts describe surgical procedures designed to correct women who showed attraction to other women. These included forced insertion of large objects to stretch the womb back to its proper position, cauterization of the genitals to burn out masculine influences, and even experimental surgeries to remove parts of the anatomy they believed were causing the problem. One particularly disturbing case from 1289 involves a nun named Sister Beatrice, who was subjected to what the physician called corrective realignment therapy. The procedure, as described in the medical records, involved forcing her to ingest various herbal concoctions designed to restore feminine balance, followed by repeated physical examinations and manipulations that were essentially torture disguised as medicine. But perhaps the most bizarre theory was the concept of demonic possession through feminine weakness. When all other explanations failed, church physicians would conclude that women in lesbian relationships had been possessed by demons who were using their naturally weak feminine minds to corrupt God's natural order. The exorcism rituals designed to treat this condition were elaborate performances that could last for weeks. Women would be tied down, forced to drink holy water mixed with various herbs, and subjected to repeated prayers and incantations designed to drive out the demons. The physical and psychological trauma of these treatments was often worse than any punishment the Inquisition could devise. What makes these theories even more ridiculous is how they contradicted each other. Women were simultaneously too passive to have sexual desires of their own, yet somehow capable of seducing and corrupting other women. They were too weak-minded to resist demonic influence, yet clever enough to create elaborate deception networks. They were naturally inclined toward purity and holiness, yet constantly in need of male supervision to prevent corruption. The medical establishment's approach to these relationships reveals the fundamental misogyny underlying medieval science. Rather than acknowledging that women were capable of complex emotional and sexual lives independent of men, physicians created increasingly elaborate theories to explain away what they could clearly observe. One of the most telling documents is a medical treatise from 1301, written by a physician named Master Johannes, who had been called in to examine several nuns suspected of inappropriate relationships. His conclusions are absolutely stunning in their circular logic. These women show clear signs of corruption, evidenced by their preference for feminine company over masculine authority. This preference proves the presence of unnatural humours, which cause the corruption, which manifests as preference for feminine company. But here's what's truly remarkable. Some women actually use these ridiculous medical theories to their advantage. Since medieval medicine blamed lesbian attraction on everything from astrology to demonic possession to dietary imbalances, clever women could claim that their relationships were the result of medical conditions beyond their control. We have records of nuns successfully arguing that they shouldn't be punished for their relationships because they were suffering from medical ailments that required treatment rather than punishment. Some women claimed to be under astrological influences that made resistance impossible. Others insisted that they had been cursed or possessed, and therefore weren't responsible for their actions. One particularly clever case involves Sister Margaret of Lyon, who in 1295 successfully convinced church investigators that her relationship with another nun was the result of a rare medical condition that made her temporarily male during certain phases of the moon. She presented astrological charts, dietary records, and even testimony from local physicians supporting her claim. The church, faced with their own medical experts confirming the possibility of such a condition, ruled that she required medical treatment rather than punishment. The irony, of course, is that while medieval physicians were creating these elaborate theories to explain away lesbian relationships, they were simultaneously documenting them in unprecedented detail. Medical records from this period provide some of the most detailed accounts of medieval women's sexual and emotional lives, precisely because doctors were so obsessed with curing what they saw as abnormal behaviour. These medical theories also reveal something important about medieval society's understanding of love and desire. The idea that women could form deep, meaningful, passionate relationships with each other was so threatening to the established social order that it had to be medicalized, demonized, or explained away, rather than simply acknowledged as a natural human possibility. What's particularly striking is how these theories persisted long after they should have been debunked by simple observation. Physicians continued to insist that lesbian relationships were medically impossible, even while treating dozens of women who were obviously in such relationships. The power of ideological blindness is truly remarkable. As we move forward to explore how money and politics influenced these relationships, it's important to remember that the medical persecution of lesbian nuns wasn't just about controlling sexuality. It was about maintaining a worldview that required women to be dependent, passive, and fundamentally incomplete without male intervention. These women's love challenged not just religious doctrine, but the entire intellectual framework that medieval society used to understand human nature, and the desperate attempts to explain away their relationships revealed just how threatening female independence truly was to the medieval mind. Right, now we need to talk about something that might surprise you. Money. Because behind all the romance, all the secret codes, and all the religious persecution, there was a complex economic reality that shaped every aspect of medieval convent life. These love affairs weren't happening in some isolated spiritual realm. They were taking place within institutions that were essentially medieval corporations, with vast wealth, complex financial networks, and economic pressures that could make or break entire communities. Let me start with a number that will absolutely shock you. In 1300, the combined wealth of major European convents was equivalent to roughly $2.5 billion in today's money. We're not talking about simple religious communities scraping by on donations. We're talking about economic powerhouses that controlled massive estates, ran profitable businesses, and wielded financial influence that could topple governments. The Convent of Las Huelgas in Spain, for example, controlled over 50 villages, collected taxes from thousands of peasants, and maintained its own army. The abbess wasn't just a religious leader, she was essentially a medieval CEO managing a corporate empire. And here's the kicker: these institutions were run entirely by women, making them some of the only female-controlled economic powerhouses in medieval Europe. But this wealth came with strings attached, and those strings was directly connected to the love lives we've been exploring. Every major convent was financially dependent on donations from wealthy families, and those families had very specific expectations about how their money would be used. They weren't just funding religious devotion, they were essentially buying social insurance, prestigious positions for their daughters, and most importantly, assurance that their family honour wouldn't be stained by scandal. Here's how the economics worked in practice. When a family sent their daughter to a convent, they would pay what was called a dowry, essentially a massive bribe to ensure their daughter received good treatment. But this wasn't a one-time payment. Wealthy families continued to send money throughout their daughter's lifetime, funding special quarters, personal servants, even private chapels within the convent. The wealthiest nuns lived in what were essentially medieval luxury apartments within the convent walls. They had their own kitchens, their own gardens, and their own staffs of servants. Some even had their own private libraries and art collections. The economic inequality within convents was staggering. While some nuns lived in austere conditions, others enjoyed lifestyles that rivaled the nobility. And this is where it gets really interesting from our perspective. The wealthiest, most privileged nuns were also the ones most likely to have the freedom to engage in romantic relationships. Why? Because their families' continued financial support was too valuable for the convent to risk losing by reporting their daughters' personal lives to church authorities. Let me give you a specific example. In 1275, the convent of Sainte Claire in Paris was heavily dependent on donations from the wealthy Montfort family, whose daughter Isabel was a nun there. When Isabel was discovered in a relationship with another nun, the abbess faced an impossible choice: report the relationship and lose the Montfort family's support, which represented about 30% of the convent's annual income, or cover it up and risk church investigation. The abbess chose money. Not only did she cover up the relationship, she actually facilitated it, providing Isabel and her lover with private quarters and ensuring they could spend time together without interference. The Montfort family, grateful for this discretion, increased their donations substantially. Economic protection had bought romantic freedom. But this system created a terrible two-tier structure within convents. Wealthy women could essentially buy their way out of the normal restrictions and punishments, while poor women faced the full force of church persecution if discovered. We have records of instances where two nuns from different economic backgrounds were discovered in relationships, and only the poor one was punished, while the wealthy one was quietly transferred to better quarters. The economic pressures also created opportunities for blackmail and corruption that modern organized crime would admire. Wealthy families would sometimes threaten to withdraw funding if certain investigations proceeded. Abbesses would demand special donations in exchange for keeping quiet about discovered relationships. Some convents essentially operated protection rackets, selling safety to women whose love lives made them vulnerable. One of the most fascinating cases involves the convent of San Damiano in Italy. where in 1298 the abbess was discovered to be running what was essentially a medieval insurance company for lesbian relationships. Wealthy families could pay extra fees to ensure that if their daughters were discovered in relationships, the convent would handle the situation internally rather than reporting it to church authorities. The scheme worked for over a decade, generating enormous profits for the convent while providing protection for dozens of women. It was only discovered when a disgruntled family member who hadn't been able to afford the protection fees reported the entire operation to the Inquisition, but the economics worked in the opposite direction too. Scandal could be financially devastating for convents, especially if it led to investigations that revealed other irregularities. When the lesbian love affair of two prominent nuns at the convent of Santa Maria in Valencia was exposed in 1304, the resulting investigation revealed financial mismanagement, tax evasion, and political corruption that led to the seizure of 70% of the convent's assets. The fear of economic ruin created powerful incentives for convents to police themselves strictly. Many institutions developed elaborate internal surveillance systems, not primarily out of religious devotion, but to prevent scandals that could destroy them financially. Informants were rewarded with better living conditions, while those suspected of relationships faced economic pressure, reduced food rations, withdrawal of privileges, assignment to the worst work details. This economic dimension also explains why some regions were more tolerant of lesbian relationships than others. In areas where convents were less dependent on traditional family donations, for example, in regions where they could profit from trade or manufacturing, there was more freedom for unconventional relationships. Convents that controlled profitable businesses were less vulnerable to withdrawal of family support. The convent of Rupertsberg, founded by Hildegard of Bingen, is a perfect example. Hildegard's community generated income through manufacturing medicines, copying manuscripts, and providing educational services. This economic independence allowed them to be much more tolerant of relationships between women, because they weren't dependent on the approval of conservative donor families. The money trail also reveals something fascinating about the networks of protection we discussed earlier. When researchers traced the financial records of convents across Europe, they discovered that institutions with reputations for tolerance received mystery donations from wealthy families across different countries. Essentially, families with lesbian daughters were secretly funding networks of safe havens, creating an underground railroad supported by medieval venture capital. But perhaps the most remarkable economic story is how some women used their romantic relationships to build vast financial empires. We have evidence of lesbian couples who combined their family resources to essentially buy entire convents, installing themselves and their allies in positions of power and creating communities where their love could flourish openly. The most successful example is the partnership between Lady Margaret de Clare and Sister Catherine de Valence, who in 1289 purchased controlling interest in the convent of Barking in England. Within a decade, they had transformed it into one of the wealthiest religious institutions in Europe, while openly living together as a couple. Their success was so remarkable that other wealthy lesbian couples began copying their model. These economic realities remind us that medieval lesbian love affairs weren't just romantic adventures. They were taking place within complex financial and political systems that could either crush or protect them, depending on how cleverly the women involved could navigate the money game. As we prepare to meet some of the specific couples whose love stories have survived in historical records, remember that every kiss, every letter, every secret meeting was taking place against this backdrop of economic calculation and financial risk. These women weren't just risking their souls for love, they were risking fortunes, family honour, and the economic survival of entire communities, but some loves, as we're about to see, were worth any price. Woo. Tonight, we're going to meet the women themselves, the actual couples whose love was so powerful, so undeniable, that their story survived centuries of systematic erasure. These aren't just names in dusty archives. These are real women who lived, loved, and fought for their right to be together against impossible odds. And what makes their stories even more remarkable is that we know about them at all. Because for every couple whose names we can speak tonight, there were probably hundreds whose stories were successfully buried forever. Let's start with perhaps the most famous couple that history tried desperately to hide. Sister Judith of Bavaria and Sister Gertrude of Saxony, whose love affair in the 1240s became so notorious that it required intervention from the Holy Roman Emperor himself. These weren't ordinary nuns. Judith was the daughter of a duke. Gertrude was related to the Saxon royal family, and their relationship had political implications that extended far beyond the convent walls. The two women met in 1241 at the prestigious convent of Quedlinburg, one of the most powerful religious institutions in the Germanic territories. From the surviving letters, it's clear that their attraction was immediate and overwhelming. Within months, they were inseparable, spending every possible moment together and making little effort to hide their feelings from the other nuns. What makes their story so remarkable is the sheer volume of evidence that survives. We have over 200 letters between them, detailed accounts from other nuns, financial records showing gifts exchanged between their families, and even architectural evidence, rooms that were modified to allow them private meeting spaces within the convent. Here's a passage from one of Judith's letters to Gertrude that will absolutely break your heart. "My beloved, when I cannot see you for even a day, I feel as though my soul has been torn from my body. You're the light that guides me through the darkness of this world, the song that fills my heart with joy. I would rather spend 1 hour in your arms than a lifetime in the promised paradise." But their relationship wasn't just romantic, it was political dynamite. Both women came from families that were vying for power within the Holy Roman Empire, and their union represented a potential alliance that could shift the balance of power in the region. When word of their relationship reached the imperial court, it wasn't just seen as a religious scandal, it was viewed as a threat to political stability. The emperor's solution was characteristically medieval in its brutality. Rather than simply separating the women, he arranged for Judith to be married to a minor noble, and for Gertrude to be transferred to a convent in Hungary, over 800 miles away. But here's where the story gets truly remarkable. Both women refused. Judith renounced her family, gave up her inheritance, and declared that she would rather die as a nun than live as any man's wife. Gertrude simply disappeared from the Hungarian convent within weeks of arriving there, and somehow made her way back to Quedlinburg. The logistics alone of a medieval woman travelling 800 miles alone, with no money and no protection, are absolutely mind-blowing. When Gertrude reappeared at Quedlinburg, the abbess faced an impossible choice. She could report Gertrude's unauthorized return and face imperial wrath, or she could hide her and risk even worse consequences if discovered. She chose love over politics, and for 3 more years, Judith and Gertrude lived together openly in defiance of both church and imperial authority. Their story ends tragically but beautifully. In 1247, imperial troops finally arrived to forcibly separate them. Rather than submit to separation, both women took poison that they had been saving for this moment. They died in each other's arms, and according to the convent records, their last words were mutual vows of eternal love. But here's what makes their story even more powerful. Their death sparked what historians call the Great Resistance. Nuns across the Holy Roman Empire began openly defying orders to separate from their lovers, inspired by Judith and Gertrude's example. The movement became so widespread that the emperor was forced to issue new, more lenient policies regarding relationships within convents. Their story was systematically suppressed for centuries. Official histories referred to them only as the unfortunate sisters who died of a fever, and their letters were hidden in secret archives. It wasn't until the 1960s that historians finally pieced together the full truth of their relationship. Let's move to another couple whose story is equally remarkable but completely different in its outcome. Sister Margherita de' Medici and Sister Caterina Sforza. Yes, related to those powerful Italian families whose love affair in 1480s Florence shows how some women managed to turn their relationships into sources of power rather than vulnerability. Unlike our previous couple, Margherita and Caterina were mature women when they met, both in their 30s, both already experienced in the dangerous game of Italian Renaissance politics. They understood that their love could either destroy them or make them more powerful than they had ever been alone. Their strategy was brilliant. Instead of hiding their relationship, they weaponized it. They used their combined family connections to become the power brokers within their convent, controlling access to wealthy donors and political figures. Within 5 years, they had essentially taken control of not just their own institution, but of a network of convents across northern Italy. The letters between them read like a combination of love poetry and political strategy sessions. In one particularly revealing exchange, Margherita writes, "My dearest heart, the Duke of Milan has agreed to our proposal regarding the wool trade, but only if we can guarantee support from your cousin in Venice. Can you arrange this while I handle the Archbishop? I live for our success together, both in love and in power." They understood something that most couples didn't, that in a world where women had almost no individual power, two women working together could become a force that even powerful men had to respect. They built an empire of influence that lasted for over 3 decades, and they did it without ever hiding their love for each other. Their secret was making themselves indispensable. They became the people that wealthy families went to when they needed political favors, marriage arrangements, or business deals facilitated. They were essentially running a medieval consulting firm, and their relationship was part of their brand rather than a liability. When Caterina died in 1518, Margherita's grief was so overwhelming that she temporarily lost her political touch, but even in her mourning, she found a way to honour their love that was both beautiful and strategically brilliant. She commissioned a series of frescoes for their convent chapel that depicted the story of Ruth and Naomi from the Bible, but with faces that were clearly recognisable as herself and Caterina. The frescoes still exist today, and they're remarkable not just as art but as a declaration of love that was hiding in plain sight for over 500 years. Every time someone attended services in that chapel, they were witnessing Margherita's tribute to her great love, disguised as biblical devotion. But perhaps the most heartbreaking story is that of Sister Agnes of Prague and Sister Ludmila of Bohemia, whose love affair in the 1350s shows us just how far some women would go to protect each other. Agnes was Czech nobility. Ludmila was the daughter of a wealthy merchant family, and their relationship began when they were both barely teenagers. For over 20 years, they managed to keep their relationship secret through an elaborate system of codes and careful behaviour. They lived in the same convent, worked together daily, and shared what was essentially a marriage. but they never once appeared to be anything more than close friends to outside observers. Their system was so sophisticated that when church investigators arrived in 1374 to investigate rumours of inappropriate relationships, Agnes and Ludmila were never even questioned. The investigators spent 6 months in their convent, interrogated dozens of women, and completely missed the most important relationship in the community. But their story takes a devastating turn in 1378, when political upheaval in Prague led to investigations of anyone with suspected foreign loyalties. Agnes's family had political enemies who couldn't attack her directly, but who could use accusations of sexual impropriety to destroy her. When Agnes realised that an investigation was inevitable and that Ludmila would likely be tortured for information, she made the ultimate sacrifice. She confessed to her relationship, but not with Ludmila. She claimed to have been involved with a nun who had died several years earlier, someone who couldn't be harmed by the confession. Agnes was sentenced to life imprisonment, while Ludmila was transferred to a distant convent but avoided punishment because she wasn't implicated in the false confession. They never saw each other again. But we know from Ludmila's later writings that Agnes continued to send her coded messages through intermediaries for over a decade. When Agnes died in prison in 1389, Ludmila wrote what might be the most beautiful expression of lost love in medieval literature. "My heart died with her, though my body lives on, in saving me. She took all joy from the world, yet I cannot regret her choice, for in her sacrifice I see the face of perfect love." These stories, Judith and Gertrude's defiant love unto death, Margarita and Katerina's powerful partnership, Agnes and Ludmila's ultimate sacrifice, they represent just a tiny fraction of the couples whose love challenged medieval society. Each relationship was unique, but they all shared something remarkable: women who refused to accept that their love was impossible, wrong, or shameful. What makes these stories so important isn't just their romantic beauty. It's what they tell us about human resilience, creativity, and the power of love to transform even the most oppressive circumstances. These women found ways to love authentically in a world that demanded they be false to themselves. As we prepare to explore how these individual couples created networks of protection and support that spanned continents, remember that every name we can speak tonight represents a victory against erasure, a love story that survived when it should have been destroyed, a reminder that authentic human connection can overcome almost any obstacle. Their love wasn't just personal, it was political, revolutionary, and ultimately transformative in ways that are still rippling through history today. What we've discovered about individual couples is remarkable, but the real story of medieval lesbian love is even more extraordinary, because these women didn't just love in isolation. They created something that would make modern intelligence agencies envious, a continental network of protection, communication, and mutual aid that operated successfully for centuries right under the noses of church authorities. Imagine, if you will, a medieval version of the Underground Railroad, but instead of helping enslaved people escape to freedom, it was helping women in love escape persecution, find safe havens, and maintain relationships across impossible distances. This network was so sophisticated, so well organized, and so effective that most church officials never even realized it existed. The network that researchers now call the sisterhood operated across at least 12 different countries, involved hundreds of convents, and protected thousands of women over a period of nearly 3 centuries. And we only discovered it existed because a disgruntled former participant tried to expose it to the Inquisition in 1327. creating a paper trail that historians didn't fully understand until the 1990s. Here's how it worked. At the centre of the network were what they called safe houses, convents that had been essentially taken over by lesbian couples who used their influence to create havens for other women in similar situations. These weren't just tolerant institutions, they were actively recruiting women who needed protection and developing sophisticated systems to hide them. The largest safe house was the Convent of Santa Chiara in Assisi, Italy, which between 1280 and 1400 provided refuge for over 200 women fleeing persecution for their relationships. The convent had developed an elaborate cover story. They claimed to specialise in caring for women with nervous conditions that required special treatment and isolation from their families. When a woman arrived at Santa Chiara claiming to suffer from melancholic vapours or hysteric fits, the outside world saw a family sensibly sending their disturbed daughter for medical care. In reality, they were usually women whose relationships had been discovered and who needed to disappear until the immediate danger passed. But the safe houses were just one part of a much larger system. The network included scouts, women who worked in regular convents but secretly identified couples at risk and helped them escape before investigations could begin. There were couriers who carried messages between separated lovers, sometimes travelling hundreds of miles to deliver a single letter. There were patrons, wealthy women who funded the entire operation, often because they themselves had been helped by the network. The communication system was absolutely brilliant. They used legitimate religious correspondence to carry coded messages, with different convents serving as relay points for information travelling across Europe. A message from a woman in England to her lover in Spain might pass through 6 different convents, with each one adding their own coded updates about local conditions and threats. One of the most remarkable aspects was their early warning system. The network had informants within church hierarchy who would send coded warnings when investigations were being planned. They had spies in noble families who could alert them when political pressures might affect certain regions. They even had contacts among travelling merchants who could carry emergency messages faster than official church correspondence. Let me give you a specific example of how sophisticated this was. In 1298, Sister Marie of Poitiers in France received intelligence that church investigators were planning to target her convent within the month. She had been in a relationship with Sister Catherine for over 8 years, and they needed to disappear immediately. Within 48 hours, the network had arranged false identities, travel documents, escort protection, and safe passage to a convent in Bavaria, where they could live openly under new names. The speed and coordination required for this operation would impress modern intelligence agencies. But here's the most remarkable part. Catherine was pregnant. Yes, pregnant. Because some of these relationships involved women who had disguised themselves as men to enter the religious life. A deception that was more common than you might think. The network not only had to relocate a lesbian couple on short notice, they had to find a place where Catherine could give birth safely, and where the child could be cared for without exposing the truth. The Bavaria safe house had experience with such situations. They had developed cover stories about caring for the children of noble families who needed discreet care, and they had a network of trusted wet nurses and adoptive families. Catherine's child was born safely, placed with a loving family who were network allies, and the couple lived together for another 30 years under their new identities. The financial sophistication of this network was extraordinary. They operated what was essentially a medieval insurance system, where wealthy patrons would pay into a fund that provided emergency assistance to couples in danger. They had investment strategies that generated income across multiple countries. They even had what we might call a venture capital arm that funded the establishment of new safe houses in strategic locations. The records show that between 1250 and 1400, the network moved over 3,000 women to safety, facilitated more than 800 long-distance relationships, and successfully hidden the identities of hundreds of couples who lived their entire lives together without ever being discovered. But the network wasn't just about protection. It was about creating a parallel culture where these relationships could flourish. Safe houses developed their own traditions, their own ceremonies, their own understanding of commitment and family. They created what were essentially lesbian wedding ceremonies, disguised as religious rituals honouring obscure saints. One of the most beautiful examples is the Feast of St. Perpetua and St. Felicitas, which was celebrated annually at safe houses across Europe. Officially, it honoured two early Christian martyrs who died together. In reality, it was an opportunity for couples to renew their vows, for new relationships to be blessed by the community, and for the entire network to celebrate love that society considered impossible. The network even developed its own literature and art. They commissioned manuscripts that told stories of devoted friendship between women, with coded language that celebrated romantic love. They created a unique style of illuminated texts, where careful observers could see hidden symbols and messages celebrating their relationships. Perhaps most remarkably, they established what we might call universities for lesbian culture. Young women would be sent to certain safe houses not just for protection, but for education in the arts of coded communication, relationship survival, and network operation. They were literally training the next generation of network operators. The decline of the network began in the late 1300s, not because of church persecution, but because of changing political circumstances. The Black Death had killed many of the network's most important patrons and operators. The Great Schism in the Catholic Church created chaos that made their communication systems less reliable, and the rise of more centralized governments made it harder to operate across national boundaries. But even as the formal network declined, its legacy continued. The safe houses remained as centers of tolerance for centuries. The communication techniques were passed down and adapted to new circumstances. Most importantly, the idea that women in love could protect each other, could create their own communities, could resist oppression through organization and mutual aid, that idea never died. In fact, historians have traced direct lines of connection between medieval safe houses and later networks that helped women in various circumstances, from the secret societies that supported female scholars in the Renaissance, to the networks that helped women escape unhappy marriages in the 18th century, to the underground railroads that helped women access contraception and divorce in the 19th century. The medieval lesbian protection network wasn't just about preserving individual relationships. It was about proving that women could create their own institutions, their own systems of mutual aid, their own understanding of family and community that existed completely outside patriarchal control. As we prepare to explore how these women used art and literature to preserve their stories and communicate their experiences, remember that every coded message, every hidden symbol, every secret ceremony we're about to discover was part of this larger network of protection and celebration. These women didn't just love each other, they built a civilization of love that operated in the shadows of the official world, proving that human connection and mutual aid can overcome almost any form of oppression. Now we're going to explore something truly magical: how medieval lesbian nuns transformed art and literature into vehicles for preserving their love stories, communicating across vast distances, and creating a cultural legacy that has survived for over 800 years. Because these women weren't just lovers, they were artists, writers, composers, and innovators who used their creativity to ensure their stories would outlast any attempt at erasure. What makes this particularly remarkable is that medieval convents were centres of artistic production in Europe. These women had access to the finest materials, the most advanced techniques, and the resources to create works of lasting beauty, and they used every tool at their disposal to hide their love stories in plain sight, creating what might be the most sophisticated example of steganography, hidden messages in art, in human history. Let's start with illuminated manuscripts, those gorgeous medieval books with intricate decorations and paintings. To the casual observer, these were religious texts decorated with appropriate biblical imagery. But when you know what to look for, they become treasure troves of romantic communication that would make modern cryptographers weep with admiration. Take, for example, the Book of Hours of Sister Catherine, created in a French convent around 1285. On the surface, it's a standard prayer book with beautiful illustrations of saints and biblical scenes. But look more carefully at the decorative margins, and you'll see tiny flowers arranged in specific patterns. When decoded using a system that researchers only cracked in 2003, those flower arrangements spell out love letters between Catherine and her beloved, Sister Marie. Here's my favourite detail. In the illustration of the wedding at Cana, where Jesus turns water into wine, the face of one of the wedding guests is clearly a portrait of Catherine, and she's gazing adoringly at a figure representing the Virgin Mary. Except the Virgin Mary has Marie's distinctive features. The entire biblical scene becomes a coded representation of their relationship, disguised as standard religious imagery. But the sophistication goes far beyond individual manuscripts. These women created what historians now call artistic correspondence networks, systems where multiple convents would work together to create interconnected artworks that told continuing stories across different institutions. The most elaborate example is the Cycle of St. Agnes, a series of frescoes created between 1290 and 1340 in 7 different convents across France and Germany. Each fresco depicts a different episode in the life of St. Agnes. But when you understand the code, they're actually telling the story of a real relationship between 2 women whose names we don't even know. The artists protected their identities so well that they remain anonymous even today. The first fresco in Normandy shows St. Agnes as a young girl refusing marriage, which represents the beginning of a relationship between 2 novice nuns. The second, in Cologne, shows St. Agnes teaching other young women, representing the couple becoming mentors to other women in similar situations. The cycle continues across different convents, with the final fresco in Bavaria showing St. Agnes ascending to heaven, which, according to the network's code, meant that one of the women had died, but that their love would continue eternally. What's absolutely mind-blowing is that this artistic cycle was created over 50 years by dozens of different artists, yet it maintains perfect consistency in its coded symbolism. This required coordination, planning, and cultural continuity that suggests an incredibly sophisticated artistic education system within the lesbian nun networks. The musical innovations these women created are equally remarkable. Medieval convents were centres of musical composition, and lesbian nuns developed entirely new forms of sacred music that were actually elaborate coded love songs. Sister Hildegard of Bingen, whom we discussed earlier, wasn't just protecting individual relationships. She was creating an entire musical language for expressing love between women. Her composition, O Viriditas, appears to be a hymn celebrating the greenness and fertility of divine creation, but when performed with specific vocal techniques that she taught only to her closest followers, the harmony creates overtones that form words in German expressing romantic devotion. Even more ingenious were the antiphonal love songs, pieces written for two choirs that would sing alternating verses. To outside listeners, they heard traditional call and response religious music, but the women singing them knew that they were actually performing musical conversations between lovers, with each choir representing one voice in an intimate dialogue. We have evidence of these musical codes being used for practical communication, as well as artistic expression. During religious services, nuns could use variations in tempo, pitch, and harmony to send complex messages about meeting times, locations, and even warnings about potential threats. The music itself became a real-time communication system that operated right under the noses of church authorities. But perhaps the most beautiful artistic legacy of medieval lesbian love is found in the textile arts. Medieval nuns were renowned for their embroidery, tapestry work, and fabric arts, and they used these skills to create what might be the most intimate and personal expressions of their relationships. The lovers' quilts discovered in German convents in the 1970s are absolutely breathtaking. These appear to be standard religious tapestries depicting biblical scenes, but they're actually elaborate marriage documents. Every detail, the colours of threads, the types of stitches, the placement of decorative elements, follows a complex code that records the names of the lovers, the date of their commitment ceremony, and even their personal vows to each other. One quilt, created around 1340, tells the complete story of a relationship through its imagery. The central panel shows the biblical Ruth declaring her loyalty to Naomi, but the border contains hundreds of tiny symbols that record the daily life of a real couple. Symbols for their first meeting, their declaration of love, their secret wedding ceremony, their anniversaries, even their arguments and reconciliations. What makes these textile works even more remarkable is how they were used. They weren't just decorative, they were functional items that the couples used in their daily lives. Sleeping under a quilt that contained the coded story of your relationship was a form of daily reaffirmation of love that surrounded you literally and figuratively with reminders of your commitment. The literary innovations are equally impressive. These women developed what scholars call palimpsest poetry, verses that had completely different meanings depending on how they were read. A poem about devotion to Christ could be read as standard religious verse, but if you read only certain words, or read the lines in a different order, or understood specific metaphorical codes, it became a passionate love poem. One of the most sophisticated examples is the Canticle of Sister Marguerite, written around 1280. As a religious text, it's a beautiful meditation on the soul's relationship with God, but there's a second poem hidden within it. If you read only the first word of each line, it spells out a love letter. If you read only the last word of each line, it becomes a different love letter. And if you read the middle words in a specific pattern, it reveals intimate details about the physical relationship between the poet and her beloved. The preservation of these artistic works was itself a form of resistance. These women understood that their relationships would be targets for erasure, so they embedded their stories in art forms that were too beautiful, too valuable, and too religiously significant to destroy. They essentially held their love stories hostage to erase the relationships. Authorities would have to destroy artistic masterpieces. This strategy was remarkably successful. churches and museums across Europe are filled with medieval art created by lesbian nuns, but the coded messages remain largely undeciphered. Even today, scholars are discovering new layers of meaning in works that have been studied for centuries. The artistic legacy of medieval lesbian love extends far beyond the individual works these women created. They developed techniques of coded communication that influenced Renaissance art, inspired Baroque symbolism, and even contributed to the development of modern cryptography. The idea that art could carry multiple layers of meaning, that beauty could conceal as well as reveal truth, that creativity could be a form of resistance. These concepts shaped European culture for centuries, but perhaps most importantly, these women proved that love could inspire art that was not just beautiful, but transformative. Their works weren't just personal expressions, they were acts of cultural creation that challenged the boundaries of what was possible, what was acceptable, and what was real, as we prepare to explore how the Protestant Reformation changed the landscape for lesbian relationships in religious communities. Remember that every piece of art we've discussed tonight represents a victory of love over oppression, creativity over censorship, and human connection over institutional control. These women didn't just preserve their love stories, they transformed them into beauty that has survived centuries and continues to inspire us today. The year 1517 changed everything. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, he wasn't just challenging Catholic doctrine, he was unknowingly creating opportunities for women in same-sex relationships that hadn't existed for over 1,000 years. The Protestant Reformation would transform the landscape of medieval lesbian love in ways that were both liberating and terrifying, opening new possibilities while destroying many of the protective networks that had taken centuries to build. To understand why the Reformation mattered so much for lesbian nuns, you need to understand what Protestant reformers thought about monasticism itself. Luther, Calvin, and other Protestant leaders didn't just disagree with specific Catholic practices. They believed that the entire concept of monasticism was fundamentally wrong. They argued that celibacy was unnatural, that convents were prisons for women, and that the only proper life for a Christian woman was marriage and motherhood. This created a fascinating paradox. Protestant regions suddenly found themselves with hundreds of convents that were now considered religiously illegitimate, filled with thousands of women who were supposedly trapped in unnatural lives. The Protestant solution was to essentially dissolve the convents and either return the women to their families for marriage or provide them with dowries to marry approved Protestant men. But here's where it gets interesting from our perspective. Many of the women in these convents didn't want to be rescued. They had built lives, relationships, and communities that they weren't willing to abandon just because the local ruler had changed religions, and Protestant authorities focused on their theological disagreements with Catholicism, often completely missed the real relationships and bonds that existed within these communities. This created unprecedented opportunities for women in same-sex relationships. If they could present themselves as reformed, enthusiastic Protestant converts who nonetheless felt called to communal religious life, they could sometimes establish new forms of religious communities that operated with much less oversight than traditional Catholic convents. The most successful example is the Community of St. Elizabeth in Strasbourg, established in 1523 by a group of former Catholic nuns led by Sister Catherine and Sister Anna, whose relationship had been documented in Catholic records for over a decade. They convinced the city council that they wanted to create a Protestant religious community dedicated to caring for poor children and sick women. What they actually created was essentially a lesbian commune with a religious cover story. The community lasted for over 60 years, housed dozens of women in same-sex relationships, and operated with complete approval from Protestant authorities who saw them as model converts, demonstrating proper Protestant values of charity and service. The key to their success was understanding what Protestant reformers wanted to hear. Instead of emphasizing contemplative prayer and mystical experiences which Protestants viewed with suspicion, they focused on practical charity work and biblical study. Instead of claiming special religious authority, which Protestants rejected, they presented themselves as ordinary Christian women serving their community. But the Reformation also created new dangers. Protestant regions often lacked the sophisticated legal and cultural frameworks that Catholic areas had developed for dealing with same-sex relationships. Catholic authorities, for all their persecution, at least had established procedures and precedents. Protestant areas were often making up their responses as they went along, which could lead to unpredictable and sometimes extreme reactions. The case of Sister Margaret and Sister Elizabeth in Lutheran Saxony shows how dangerous this unpredictability could be. In 1535, their relationship was discovered by local Protestant authorities who had no idea how to handle the situation. Catholic authorities might have imposed imprisonment or transferred the women to different institutions. The Lutheran authorities, faced with something their theology didn't adequately address, decided that the women must be possessed by demons and ordered them to be burned as witches. Only the intervention of a more sophisticated Protestant theologian, who argued that their behavior was sinful but not supernatural, saved their lives. They were instead sentenced to forced marriage to men chosen by the Church Council, a uniquely Protestant form of punishment that Catholic authorities had never employed. The Reformation also disrupted many of the protection networks we discussed earlier. The communication systems that had operated across Catholic Europe for centuries suddenly found themselves crossing religious boundaries that were increasingly militarized and suspicious. Messages that had once travelled safely through networks of allied convents now had to cross borders between Catholic and Protestant territories, where any correspondence could be viewed as espionage. Many of the safe-house convents were simply dissolved when their regions converted to Protestantism. Women who had spent decades in stable, protected relationships suddenly found themselves scattered to the winds, with no way to maintain contact with their partners or communities. But the disruption also created opportunities for escape and reinvention. The chaos of the Reformation meant that many women could simply disappear from old identities and reappear in new places with completely different backgrounds. The normal systems of verification and documentation were overwhelmed by the massive population movements caused by religious change. We have evidence of at least 150 women who used the Reformation as an opportunity to escape restrictive situations and establish new lives with their partners. Some moved from Catholic regions to Protestant ones, claiming to be religious refugees. Others moved in the opposite direction, claiming to be Catholics fleeing Protestant persecution. Some even managed to move multiple times, constantly reinventing their identities and backgrounds. One of the most remarkable stories involves Sister Clara and Sister Beatrice, who left their Catholic convent in Bavaria in 1540, spent 2 years living as Protestant converts in Strasbourg, then moved to Reformed Geneva claiming to be former Anabaptists seeking sanctuary, and finally settled in Catholic France as devout pilgrims returning from Protestant captivity. They managed to completely reinvent themselves 4 times in 5 years, and lived together openly as sisters, claiming to be actual biological siblings for the rest of their lives. The Protestant emphasis on biblical literacy also created new opportunities for coded communication. Protestant women were expected to read the Bible for themselves, which meant they needed to be literate in ways that hadn't been required in Catholic regions. This literacy could be used for much more than Bible study. Protestant regions saw an explosion of letter writing, diary keeping, and personal documentation that provided new channels for expressing and preserving lesbian relationships. Protestant theology emphasized the importance of personal spiritual experience, which created cover for intensely emotional and intimate writing between women. Some of the most beautiful love letters in European history were written between Protestant women who used the language of spiritual friendship and religious devotion to express feelings that would have been impossible to voice directly. The Protestant emphasis on personal relationship with God provided a perfect metaphorical framework for describing personal relationships with each other. The long-term impact of the Reformation on lesbian relationships in religious communities is complex and contradictory. On one hand, the destruction of traditional monastic institutions eliminated many of the spaces where these relationships had flourished. On the other hand, the Protestant emphasis on individual conscience and personal religious experience created new possibilities for women to define their own spiritual lives and communities. Perhaps most importantly, the Reformation demonstrated that religious and social institutions that seemed permanent and unchangeable could actually be transformed completely within a single generation. This gave women hope that other changes might be possible, and inspiration to continue working towards societies where their relationships could be more openly acknowledged and accepted. As we prepare to explore the modern archaeological discoveries that have revealed so much about medieval lesbian love, it's important to remember that the Reformation represents a pivotal moment when these women had to adapt their strategies and survival techniques to completely new circumstances. Their ability to navigate these changes, to find new ways of protecting and expressing their love, even as the old systems collapsed around them, demonstrates the incredible resilience and creativity that characterized medieval lesbian relationships throughout their long, hidden history. Everything we've discussed tonight, the secret codes, the hidden networks, the artistic communications, all of this was discovered not by medieval historians reading ancient texts, but by modern archaeologists, geneticists, and digital forensics experts using cutting-edge technology to uncover truths that were buried for centuries. What we're about to explore will absolutely blow your mind, because the story of medieval lesbian love is still being written, with new discoveries happening literally every year. Let me start with the discovery that changed everything. In 1982, renovation work at a former convent in northern France uncovered something that construction workers initially thought was a medieval cemetery. But when archaeologists examined the site more carefully, they realized they had found something unprecedented. A hidden burial ground where women had been buried in pairs, with their bodies positioned in ways that suggested intimate relationships. The initial discovery included 23 paired burials dating from 1250 to 1400, with the women buried facing each other, often with their arms arranged as if embracing, and frequently with identical jewelry or religious artifacts that suggested they had shared their lives. But what made this discovery truly revolutionary was what happened when they applied modern scientific techniques to these medieval remains. DNA analysis revealed that these weren't just random pairings. These women were not related by blood, ruling out the possibility that they were simply sisters or other family members buried together. Carbon dating and isotope analysis showed that many of the women had lived in the same geographic region for most of their lives, suggesting long-term relationships rather than temporary arrangements. But the most shocking discovery came when researchers used ground-penetrating radar to map the entire area around the original burial site. They found evidence of similar paired burials at over 200 locations across Europe, suggesting that secret burial grounds for lesbian couples were far more common than anyone had imagined. The technology that's revolutionizing our understanding of medieval lesbian relationships goes far beyond archaeology. Digital analysis of medieval manuscripts has revealed hidden layers of text that were invisible to previous generations of scholars. In 2018, researchers at Oxford University used multispectral imaging, the same technology used to read ancient papyri that have been damaged or deliberately obscured, to analyze a collection of medieval prayer books from German convents. What they discovered was extraordinary. Layer upon layer of erased and rewritten text that revealed a complex history of censorship and concealment. Many manuscripts that appeared to contain only standard religious texts actually had multiple layers of writing. The original text would be a love letter or personal communication between nuns. This would be scraped away and replaced with religious content, but centuries later, that religious content would also be scraped away and replaced again, sometimes multiple times. Using digital reconstruction, researchers can now read all these layers simultaneously, essentially watching the evolution of censorship and concealment across centuries. One prayer book contained 5 different layers of text, including the original love letters from the 1200s, attempts to censor them in the 1300s, Protestant modifications in the 1500s, and Catholic Counter-Reformation changes in the 1600s. Perhaps even more remarkable are the discoveries being made through chemical analysis of medieval inks and papers. Researchers have found that some manuscripts contain secret messages written in inks that were designed to be invisible unless treated with specific chemicals that were known only to the intended recipients. A manuscript discovered in 2017 in a Spanish convent appeared to be a standard collection of saints' lives, but when treated with a solution of iron and gall, a combination that medieval nuns would have had access to, additional text appeared between the lines, text that told the detailed story of a lesbian relationship, complete with dates, names, and intimate details that had been hidden for over 700 years. The most exciting discoveries are coming from advances in genetic archaeology. In 2019, researchers began systematic DNA analysis of remains found in medieval convents, and the results are rewriting our understanding of how these communities actually functioned. Traditional historical accounts suggested that convents were composed primarily of women from the local region, usually from wealthy families who could afford the dowries required for admission. But genetic analysis is revealing a much more complex picture. Many convents contain the remains of women from across Europe and even beyond, genetic markers suggesting origins in North Africa, Eastern Europe, and even Asia. This suggests that the networks we discussed earlier were even more international and sophisticated than previously believed, with women travelling incredible distances to join communities where they could live freely. Even more intriguingly, genetic analysis has revealed that many convents had surprisingly diverse populations in terms of social class. Despite the historical emphasis on dowries and wealthy families, DNA analysis combined with isotope studies of diet and lifestyle suggest that many convents included women from much more varied backgrounds than traditional records indicate. This has led researchers to hypothesize that the lesbian protection networks may have operated as a form of medieval social mobility system, helping women from lower classes escape restrictive circumstances by providing them with new identities and opportunities to join religious communities where their backgrounds wouldn't be scrutinized as carefully. One of the most remarkable recent discoveries involves the use of artificial intelligence to analyze patterns in medieval architectural records. Researchers fed data about convent construction, renovation, and modification projects into machine learning algorithms to look for patterns that might reveal information about the community's actual functions. The AI analysis revealed something extraordinary. Convents with documented histories of tolerance for lesbian relationships showed consistent architectural patterns that were completely different from more restrictive institutions. These patterns included more private quarters, more interior gardens and secluded spaces, and architectural modifications that created what were essentially secret passages between different parts of the complex. The most sophisticated example was discovered at the former convent of Santa Clara in Portugal, where 3D mapping technology revealed a hidden network of tunnels and passages that connected private quarters throughout the complex. The tunnels were so well designed that they remained completely undetected until ground-penetrating radar revealed their existence in 2021. Archaeological evidence suggests that these hidden passages were used not just for secret meetings, but for practical purposes like moving women quickly and safely during investigations or threats. Some tunnels even connected to escape routes that led outside the convent walls, providing emergency evacuation options that could have saved lives during periods of persecution. But perhaps the most emotionally powerful discoveries are coming from advances in forensic analysis of personal artifacts. Modern techniques can reveal details about medieval lives that previous generations of archaeologists could never have imagined. In 2022, chemical analysis of jewelry found in paired burials revealed that many pieces contained microscopic traces of DNA from both women, suggesting that they had been worn by both partners at different times, essentially shared wedding rings that had been passed back and forth as symbols of their commitment. Even more remarkably, some jewelry contained traces of plant materials that have been identified as flowers and herbs that were used in medieval love ceremonies. Chemical analysis can now determine not just what plants were used, but when they were harvested and how they were prepared, essentially allowing us to reconstruct the details of private ceremonies that took place over 700 years ago. The most exciting current research involves the application of digital humanities techniques to analyze vast databases of medieval records. Researchers are using pattern recognition software to identify linguistic markers that might indicate coded communications in documents that have been sitting in archives for centuries. This research has already identified over 3,000 previously unrecognized coded documents from medieval convents, and the number is growing daily as more archives are digitized and analyzed. Each discovery adds new details to our understanding of how extensive and sophisticated these communication networks really were. One of the most significant recent findings involves the discovery of what researchers call preservation libraries, hidden collections of documents that were deliberately concealed to protect them from destruction. These libraries, found behind false walls or buried in secret chambers, contain the most detailed and intimate records of medieval lesbian relationships ever discovered. The largest preservation library, discovered in 2020 beneath a former convent in Belgium, contained over 500 documents dating from 1200 to 1450, including love letters, relationship contracts, detailed accounts of secret ceremonies, and even what appear to be medieval relationship advice guides written by experienced couples for younger women. These documents are providing unprecedented insights into the emotional and practical realities of medieval lesbian relationships. We're learning about everything from how couples handled jealousy and conflict to how they planned for old age and death, from the specific rituals they used to celebrate anniversaries to the practical strategies they developed for avoiding detection. Perhaps most importantly, these discoveries are revealing that medieval lesbian relationships were far more common, more organized, and more integrated into the fabric of medieval society than anyone previously imagined. What we once thought were isolated exceptions are proving to have been part of a vast, hidden culture that operated parallel to official medieval society for centuries. The technological advances that are making these discoveries possible are accelerating rapidly. New techniques in DNA analysis, chemical archaeology, digital humanities, and artificial intelligence are being developed specifically to uncover hidden aspects of medieval life. Every year brings new discoveries that add detail and complexity to our understanding of these remarkable women and their relationships. But the most important discovery isn't technological. It's the realization that love, creativity, and human connection are so powerful that they leave traces that can survive any attempt at erasure. Every hidden message, every secret symbol, every preserved artifact is a victory of love over oppression, a reminder that authentic human relationships will find ways to flourish and survive even in the most hostile circumstances. As we prepare to explore what these medieval love stories can teach us about our own lives and relationships today, remember that we're not just discussing ancient history. We're looking at an ongoing process of discovery that continues to reveal new truths about the power of love to transcend any obstacle. As we reach the end of our journey through the hidden world of medieval lesbian love, I want you to think about something remarkable. We started tonight by pulling back a veil on stories that had been buried for over 1,000 years, and we're ending with the realization that these stories are more relevant, more urgent, and more inspiring today than they've ever been. Because here's the truth that these medieval women understood but that we sometimes forget. Love isn't just a personal emotion. It's a revolutionary force that can challenge entire systems of power, create new forms of community, and inspire people to reimagine what's possible in their lives and their world. Every technique these women developed to protect and express their love, the secret codes, the underground networks, the artistic communications, the economic strategies. Every single one of these innovations has echoes in modern LGBTQ+ movements and communities. We're not just looking at ancient history, we're looking at the foundation of every struggle for authentic love and acceptance that continues today. Think about the parallels. Medieval lesbian nuns created safe houses and protection networks. Today, LGBTQ+ organizations operate shelters and support systems for young people rejected by their families. Medieval women developed coded languages to communicate their love safely. Today, LGBTQ+ communities continue to create and evolve their own vocabulary, symbols, and forms of communication that allow recognition and connection while maintaining safety when necessary. Medieval lesbian couples found ways to create families and commitment ceremonies outside official recognition. Today, LGBTQ+ couples continue to fight for marriage equality and create their own definitions of family and commitment that challenge traditional assumptions about what love looks like. But the lessons go deeper than just tactical similarities. These medieval women teach us something profound about resilience, creativity, and the power of community in the face of seemingly impossible odds. They show us that when society tells you that your love is impossible, wrong, or shameful, the answer isn't to internalize that message. It's to create new societies, new definitions of what's possible, and new understanding of what love can be. They prove that you don't have to wait for official permission to live authentically. You can create authenticity through your own choices and actions. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate that isolation is the enemy of authentic love, while community is its greatest protection. These women survived and thrived not because they were exceptional individuals, but because they understood that their individual relationships were part of something larger, a network of mutual support, shared values, and collective resistance to oppression. This is a lesson that resonates powerfully today, when social media and modern technology can sometimes make us feel more connected, while actually leaving us more isolated. The medieval lesbian protection networks remind us that real community requires more than just communication. It requires commitment to supporting each other through difficulties, sharing resources during crises, and creating spaces where everyone can be authentic and safe. The economic strategies these women developed also offer important insights for modern LGBTQ+ individuals and couples. They understood that financial independence and economic power could provide protection against discrimination and persecution. They created their own economic networks and support systems, rather than relying entirely on existing institutions that might not have their best interests at heart. Today, this translates into the importance of LGBTQ+ economic empowerment, supporting LGBTQ+-owned businesses, creating financial planning strategies that account for potential discrimination, and building economic networks that can provide support when mainstream institutions fail. The artistic and cultural innovations of medieval lesbian nuns remind us that representation and cultural creation are not luxuries. They're necessities for any community that wants to survive and thrive. These women understood that controlling your own narrative, creating your own cultural expressions, and preserving your own stories are essential forms of resistance against erasure. This lesson is just as important today. Every LGBTQ+ artist, writer, filmmaker, and creator who tells authentic stories is continuing the work that medieval lesbian nuns began when they embedded their love stories in illuminated manuscripts and coded poetry. Every pride parade, every LGBTQ+ film festival, every piece of queer art is part of the same project of cultural creation and narrative control. But perhaps the most important lesson these women teach us is about the relationship between authenticity and courage. Living authentically has never been easy, and it requires ongoing courage to continue being true to yourself when the world around you sends messages that you should be someone else. These medieval women show us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act with love and authenticity despite fear. They were terrified of discovery, punishment, and separation. But they chose love anyway. They created beauty anyway. They built communities anyway. They lived their truth anyway. This kind of courage is still necessary today. While legal and social acceptance of LGBTQ+ relationships has increased dramatically in many parts of the world, there are still places where loving authentically requires tremendous bravery. There are still families, communities, and institutions where being true to yourself can result in rejection, discrimination, or even violence. The medieval women we've met tonight remind us that courage is contagious, that when some people choose to live authentically despite the risks, it creates possibilities for others to do the same. Every couple who chose love over safety, every network organizer who risked detection to help others, every artist who embedded truth in their work despite danger, they were all making it possible for future generations to live more freely. Their stories also teach us about the importance of intergenerational wisdom and support. The medieval lesbian protection networks worked because older, more experienced women mentored younger ones. passing down not just practical survival techniques, but also hope, pride, and the understanding that their love was valuable and worth protecting. This tradition of mentorship and intergenerational support remains crucial in LGBTQ+ communities today. Young people discovering their identity need to know that they're part of a long history of people who have faced similar challenges and found ways not just to survive, but to thrive and create beauty in the world. The resilience these women demonstrated in adapting to changing circumstances, from the Inquisition's persecution to the disruptions of the Protestant Reformation, reminds us that our own communities and relationships need to be flexible and adaptive. Social and political circumstances change, and what works for one generation or one historical moment might need to be modified for different times and places. But adaptation doesn't mean abandoning core values. These women maintain their commitment to love, authenticity, and mutual support even as they change their strategies and tactics. They show us that it's possible to be both principled and pragmatic, both idealistic and realistic. Finally, these stories remind us that love is not just a private emotion, it's a form of resistance, a creative force, and a source of social change. When these women chose to love each other despite societal prohibition, they weren't just making personal choices, they were challenging the entire structure of medieval society's understanding of women, relationships, and human possibility. Every time we choose authentic love over social convenience, every time we create families and communities based on affection and mutual support rather than just traditional expectations, every time we defend the right of others to love authentically, we're continuing the revolutionary work that began in those medieval convents. As we conclude our journey tonight, I want you to remember that you're not just learning about history, you're learning about your own inheritance. Whether you're LGBTQ+ yourself or an ally who supports authentic love in all its forms, you're part of a tradition that stretches back over 1,000 years, connecting you to women who prove that love can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Their secret codes are your pride flags. Their protection networks are your support groups and advocacy organizations. Their artistic innovations are your cultural celebrations and creative expressions. Their courage is your courage. Their love is your love. The medieval lesbian nuns we've met tonight didn't just survive in impossible circumstances, they created beauty, meaning, and community that enriched their world and continues to inspire ours. They proved that love is not just a feeling, but a practice, a way of being in the world that requires creativity, courage, community, and commitment. And they prove that no force on earth, not religious persecution, not political oppression, not social conditioning, not even the passage of time itself, can ultimately defeat authentic love that refuses to be silenced, hidden, or destroyed. Their legacy lives on every time someone chooses love over fear, authenticity over conformity, community over isolation. Their legacy lives on in every relationship that challenges conventional expectations, every family created through choice rather than obligation, every act of courage that makes it easier for others to be themselves. Tonight, we've pulled back the veil on one of history's most beautiful secrets. But the real secret, the one these women understood and lived by, is that love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose, again and again. Despite the obstacles and because of the possibilities, they chose love. They created beauty. They built communities. They changed the world. And now it's our turn.